There are people who are generous because they have plenty to give. And then there are people who give when they genuinely cannot afford to. I've always thought those are two completely different things. Handing someone $10 when you have $10,000 is kind. Giving away your last meal when you don't know what you'll eat tomorrow, that tells me something about you. And the woman in this story had almost nothing left. No savings, no powerful family, no husband coming home with another paycheck. Just a small ranch, a 9-year-old daughter, a stack of overdue notices, and one final proper meal sitting on the stove. Then, on one of the worst nights of her life, a stranger knocked on her door. His coat was soaked, one arm was bleeding, his horse was barely standing. Clara Bennett had no reason to trust him. She also had absolutely no food to spare. She fed him anyway. What Clara didn't know was that this tired cowboy wasn't poor. He wasn't drifting through the valley looking for work. His name was Jonathan Hale, and depending on where you stood in that part of Wyoming, you could ride for hours without leaving land he owned. The story begins in the spring of 1887 in a valley locals called Blackwater Basin. The valley stretched between two long ridgelines, covered in grass during good years and dust during bad ones. There were cattle ranches, small farms, a wooden church, a schoolhouse, a general store, and one little town called Red Creek. Clara Bennett lived 6 miles outside town with her daughter Emily. Her husband Thomas had bought their 160-acre ranch 8 years earlier. It wasn't impressive. A small house, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, a narrow creek along the eastern boundary, a half-finished fence Thomas had promised for years to repair properly. He never did. 14 months before our story begins, Thomas was thrown from a horse while moving cattle during a storm. He struck his head and never woke up. Clara was 32 when she became a widow. Emily was 8. Thomas also left behind debt. Clara sold cattle, a second horse, a good saddle, almost anything that could bring money. She repaired things herself, stretched food, learned jobs Thomas had always handled. She wasn't magically perfect at any of it. She lost calves, paid too much for supplies once, made mistakes. But she kept the ranch alive. And I like that more than writing her as some flawless frontier superhero. She survived because she was stubborn, not because she never failed. The problem was that stubbornness cannot make numbers disappear. By April of 1887, Clara owed the Red Creek Land and Cattle Bank $187. The man handling the debt was a property agent named Silas Rourke. Rourke was 46, thin, carefully dressed, polite in the way people become polite when they enjoy having power over you. He had been unusually interested in Clara's land since Thomas died. At first, he offered to help her sell. Clara refused. Then he offered to buy the ranch through investors. She refused again. By spring, the friendly part was gone. One morning, he arrived while Clara was repairing fencing and handed her a foreclosure notice. The ranch would be auctioned in 12 days unless she paid the overdue amount. Clara asked whether she could have more time. Rourke said the bank had already been generous. She asked what the ranch might sell for. $400, he said. Maybe $5. Clara stared at him. You offered me $700 last winter. Rourke paused. Then he smiled. Things change quickly. This is where I would have started asking questions. When the same man who has been trying to buy your land suddenly tells you it's worth much less right before a forced auction, something smells wrong. Clara spent the next 9 days trying to raise money. Nobody had enough to lend her. Selling the remaining cattle would barely cover part of the debt and destroy her future income. She even took Thomas's pocket watch into town. The jeweler offered $11. She stared at the watch, then put it back into her bag. There is a point where survival becomes so expensive that you start selling pieces of your own memory. 3 days before the auction, Clara had $19 in cash and very little food left. Then a cold spring storm moved into Blackwater Basin. Wind first, then rain, then sleet. By evening, the road to Red Creek was mud. Clara cooked beans with the last piece of smoked pork, fried potatoes and biscuits. It was basically the final proper meal in the house. Emily was sitting at the table when someone knocked on the door. If you live 6 miles outside a tiny western town in 1887 and somebody knocks after dark during a storm, I imagine your first reaction is not excitement. Clara took Thomas's old revolver from a drawer and approached the door. A man's voice said, "Just looking for shelter, ma'am. My horse went down." Clara asked if he was alone. He said yes. Through the window she could barely see him. Tall, early 40s, dark coat soaked through, mud everywhere, one sleeve torn, blood running along one hand. His horse stood behind him with its head lowered. Clara opened the door only slightly. The stranger introduced himself as Jonathan, just Jonathan. He said his horse had slipped crossing a wash, throwing him onto rocks. He asked whether he could sleep in the barn until the storm passed. Clara studied him. Then Emily appeared behind her and asked very loudly, "Mama, is he hungry?" Kids have an extraordinary ability to destroy carefully managed adult situations. Jonathan said he was fine. Clara asked when he last ate. He hesitated. That was enough. She looked back at the table. 2 portions. The final meal. She could have given him the barn and water. Nobody reasonable would have judged her. Instead, Clara opened the door and said, "Come inside before you freeze." She gave him one of Thomas's old shirts while she cleaned the cut on his arm. Then she took her own plate and put it in front of him. Jonathan looked at the food, then at Clara. "You already ate?" Clara said yes. Emily looked at her mother like a child watching an adult lie very badly. Jonathan noticed. He looked at the empty stove, the 2 plates, the 3 people. "I can't take your food." Clara replied, "Then don't take it. Eat it." He still hesitated. Clara sighed. "Sir, I did not spend 20 minutes cleaning blood from your arm so you could faint in my kitchen." Jonathan laughed. Then he ate. Emily asked him questions almost continuously. Where was he from? Did he own his horse? Had he ever been bitten by a snake? Had he killed anyone? Clara nearly choked on that one. Jonathan said no, unless mosquitoes counted. He told them he worked with cattle and had business near Red Creek. Both statements were true. What he didn't say was that he owned Hale Cattle Company, one of the largest ranching operations in Wyoming territory. Jonathan Hale had turned the ranch he inherited from his father into a cattle empire. He controlled tens of thousands of acres and owned a substantial share in businesses throughout the valley. And Clara had no idea. That's what I like about the West. People assume wealth always looked obvious. Sometimes a millionaire still spent 3 days in a saddle and arrived at your house looking like somebody had dragged him behind the horse. Jonathan noticed things while he ate. The repaired furniture, Emily's patched dress, the small amount of firewood, the nearly empty kitchen shelves. He understood quickly that Clara had given him food she actually needed. Then Emily casually said, "Mama says someone else might own our house on Thursday." Silence. Clara closed her eyes. Jonathan looked at her. What does she mean? Clara tried to change the subject. Eventually, she admitted the ranch was being auctioned. Jonathan asked who held the debt. Red Creek Land and Cattle. He stopped moving. Jonathan knew the bank very well. He owned 20% of it. He asked who handled her account. Silas Rourke. Another pause. Jonathan knew him too. Rourke had negotiated property acquisitions for Hale Cattle Company. Jonathan asked what Rourke had once offered for the ranch. 700. And now? He says maybe 4. Jonathan looked toward the fire, then asked whether there was anything unusual about the property. Clara laughed. If there is, I wish someone would tell me. She mentioned the creek running along the eastern boundary. Jonathan's expression changed slightly. Water access was extremely valuable in cattle country. Hale Cattle Company had recently been trying to secure connected grazing routes through that exact part of Blackwater Basin. Jonathan had authorized negotiations. He had not personally reviewed every small property. That work had been left to regional agents, including Silas Rourke. Suddenly, Clara's ranch looked much more important than 160 acres on a map. Jonathan slept in the barn. Before sunrise, Clara gave him something hot to drink and checked his arm. He offered her money. She refused. He insisted. She refused again. You fed me your supper. Clara shrugged. You'd do the same. Jonathan looked at her for a moment. I'm not sure everyone would. He could have paid her entire debt from the money he carried. She still wanted nothing. He finally said, At least let me repay the meal next time I pass through. Clara answered, If I still own the stove. He smiled, mounted his horse, and rode away. Jonathan went directly to Red Creek and walked into the bank. The manager, William Price, nearly fell out of his chair when Jonathan Hale arrived covered in dried mud. Jonathan asked for every document connected to the Bennett property. The debt was legitimate, but the auction had been accelerated under authority given to Silas Rourke. Then Jonathan found something interesting. Rourke had recommended that after foreclosure, the property be purchased by a company called Basin Agricultural Holdings. Jonathan had never heard of it. They checked the records. The company had been formed 6 months earlier. Its representative was Rourke's brother-in-law. That already looks terrible. Then Jonathan asked whether Basin Agricultural Holdings had purchased anything else. 3 properties, all small ranches, all financially distressed, all beside Blackwater Creek. They put them on a map. The parcels formed a corridor leading directly toward Clara's ranch. Her property was the final piece connecting them to enormous sections of Hale grazing land. If Rourke controlled that creek frontage, he could sell the route back to Hale Cattle Company at a huge profit. And it got worse. Several unusual payments connected the purchases to Frederick Lyle, one of Jonathan's own regional managers. Jonathan stared at the map. His employees had been using Hale's desire for water access to target struggling ranchers, buy their land cheaply through a hidden company, then sell it back at inflated prices. Clara wasn't simply unlucky. She was being selected because she was vulnerable. Jonathan ordered the bank to freeze the auction process. Price hesitated because formal paperwork had already begun. Jonathan told him not to warn Rourke. He wanted to see what happened next. Clara knew none of this. She spent the next 2 days packing. Thomas's clothes went into a trunk. Dishes were wrapped in cloth. Emily kept asking where they would live. Clara promised they would find something in town. Then she went behind the barn where Emily couldn't see her and cried. I think that matters. Strong people are allowed to be afraid. Clara believed losing the ranch meant failing Thomas and her daughter. The morning of the auction arrived bright and clear, which always seems rude when something awful is happening. Clara wore her best dress. Emily had a blue ribbon in her hair. A neighbor drove them into Red Creek. Around 30 people gathered outside the courthouse. Silas Rourke stood near the steps talking with 2 businessmen. When he saw Clara, he approached and said he was sorry. Clara replied, "You don't look sorry." Rourke told her bitterness wouldn't help Emily. Clara stepped closer. "Speak to me about my debt. Don't speak to me about my daughter." Good rule. The auction began. $300, $325, $350, $400. Rourke gave a small nod to one of the businessmen. $425. Nobody else bid. Clara stood beside Emily, watching strangers put a price on the rooms where her daughter had grown up. The auctioneer called for $450. Silence. Again. Silence. Then a voice from the back said, $1,000. Everyone turned. Clara turned too. The injured stranger from her kitchen stood at the edge of the crowd, except now he looked completely different. Clean dark coat, white shirt, polished boots. Beside him stood the bank manager and 2 men from Hale Cattle Company. Clara stared. Emily whispered, "Mama, the robber came back." I would keep that line forever. Rourke's face changed instantly. "Mr. Hale," he said. Clara heard the name. Hale. Everyone in the valley knew it. The man she had fed because she thought he might collapse in the rain was Jonathan Hale. The auctioneer started to close the sale. Jonathan raised a hand. "I'm not buying it." Everyone looked confused. Jonathan announced that the auction was being suspended pending investigation of fraudulent property acquisitions connected to the bank and Hale Cattle Company. Rourke immediately protested. Jonathan looked at Price. The bank manager confirmed the suspension. Then Jonathan turned toward Rourke. "You purchased 3 neighboring properties through a company registered to your wife's brother." Silence. "You accelerated foreclosure on this property while lowering its valuation." Rourke said everything had been legal. Jonathan asked why Basin Agricultural Holdings had already arranged financing for Clara's ranch before the auction took place. That landed. Rourke began explaining. People like him usually do when silence would be smarter. He said Jonathan had ordered employees to secure water access. Jonathan replied, "I instructed you to negotiate purchases. I did not instruct you to manufacture bankruptcies." Then Jonathan mentioned Frederick Lyle. Rourke stopped talking. Jonathan had already received information showing that Lyle had approved payments linked to Rourke's hidden company. The scheme was simple. Acquire struggling ranches cheaply, control the creek corridor, then sell the access back to Hale at an enormous markup. Jonathan announced publicly that both men were suspended from all Hale business while the matter was investigated. After the crowd dispersed, Jonathan approached Clara. He apologized for hiding who he was. Clara asked why he hadn't told her. "Would you have treated me differently?" She answered, "Yes." He looked surprised. "How?" "I would have charged you for dinner." He laughed. Then he explained the scheme. Jonathan told Clara he would pay the entire debt personally. She said no before he finished the sentence. He argued that her problem existed partly because men operating under his name had targeted her. Clara replied, "Then fix the men operating under your name." He said paying the debt would be easiest. "For you," Clara said. That is exactly why Jonathan respected her. She didn't want a millionaire to rescue her. She wanted the fair chance she had been denied. Jonathan offered another solution. Hale Cattle Company genuinely needed seasonal access to Blackwater Creek. Instead of buying Clara's ranch, the company could pay her for limited water and crossing rights, a business agreement. Clara asked how much. Jonathan gave a figure. She stared at him. "That sounds like Charity wearing a better coat." So they negotiated, right outside the courthouse. The millionaire cattle baron and the widow who had fed him beans 3 nights earlier argued over every condition until they reached a real agreement. The first payment covered a large portion of what Clara owed. The rest she could pay herself. That could have been the ending. It wasn't. 3 nights later, Clara woke to Emily screaming. The barn was on fire. Clara ran outside barefoot. Flames were already climbing through the hayloft. She opened the livestock gate and drove animals out while neighbors rushed toward the ranch. By dawn, the barn was destroyed. 2 calves were dead. Most of Clara's stored hay was gone. The sheriff inspected the ruins and found evidence of fire starting in 2 separate places. Someone had done it deliberately. Clara thought of Rourke. Jonathan did too, but Rourke had witnesses placing him at the Red Creek Hotel. Jonathan wanted guards at Clara's ranch. She refused. "Someone burned your barn," he said. "I noticed." He asked whether she simply didn't trust him. Clara said, "I don't know you." Jonathan looked frustrated. "You gave me your dinner." "That was before I knew you owned half the valley." "What difference does that make?" Clara looked at him. "Poor men can owe you gratitude. Rich men can own it." Jonathan had no answer. The breakthrough came a few days later. Several Hale cattle disappeared near Blackwater Creek. Tracks led toward one of the properties controlled by Rourke's hidden company. Jonathan and the sheriff searched an abandoned line shack there. Inside, they found altered branding equipment, stolen Hale property, and supplies connected to the ranch fire. 2 hired men were arrested. One talked. He admitted Rourke had paid them to frighten Clara into abandoning the ranch and to steal cattle to cover expenses after the land scheme began collapsing. Rourke fled Red Creek that night. He made it as far as a rail station before the sheriff's posse found him. Frederick Lyle was arrested later for his part in the property fraud. Several earlier land purchases were investigated, and 2 other families eventually regained property that had been taken through similar pressure. And Jonathan did something I think mattered more than paying Clara's debt. He admitted publicly that the scandal had happened under his company's name because he had allowed people like Lyle too much authority without enough oversight. He could have said, "I didn't know." Technically true. Instead, he said, "I should have." I respect that difference. Clara rebuilt slowly. The legitimate Hale water contract gave her stable income. Neighbors helped put up a smaller barn. By the next spring, she paid the final portion of Thomas's old debt herself. She rode into Red Creek and received the cleared loan papers from Price. When she walked outside, Jonathan was waiting across the street. He had known the payment date. Of course he had. "How does it feel?" he asked. Clara looked at the paper. "Like I owe nobody anything." Jonathan said quietly, "You never owed me." Over the following months, Jonathan found increasingly terrible excuses to visit the Bennett ranch. At first, there was always business: water access, fence repairs, cattle. Eventually, one afternoon, he rode 6 miles simply to warn Clara that rain was coming. Clara looked past him at enormous black storm clouds covering half the sky. "Good thing you came," she said. "I never would have noticed." He laughed. She made coffee. Their relationship developed slowly because both of them were too stubborn for anything else. Jonathan tried to solve problems with money. Clara sometimes refused help, even when refusing was ridiculous. He thought she was too proud. She thought he was too accustomed to getting his way. They were both correct. One autumn evening, Jonathan arrived carrying a wooden box. Clara immediately looked suspicious. "Before you say no," he said, "it isn't money." She opened it. Inside was a new set of kitchen plates. Jonathan remembered that one of hers had been cracked the night she fed him. Clara looked at him. "You noticed that?" "Yes." She lifted one plate. "These are expensive." Jonathan closed his eyes. "We were so close." Clara laughed. A year later, Jonathan asked her to marry him. Clara said no. "I know." She told him she loved him, but would not leave the Bennett ranch to live in his enormous house. Jonathan asked why she assumed she had to leave.
"Because you own a house with 14 rooms. Jonathan shrugged. "I only use 3. Honestly, I think the other 11 are mainly for dust." Eventually, they married, and instead of pulling Clara into his world, Jonathan spent more and more time at the Bennett Ranch. Clara never sold the original property to Hale Cattle Company. Apparently, Jonathan joked about buying it every few years. Apparently, Clara raised the price every time. There is one final detail I like. Years later, someone asked Jonathan Hale when he first decided Clara was different from everyone else around him. People expected him to mention the courthouse, the barn fire, the way she fought to keep her land. Jonathan said it was the dinner. He knew almost immediately that the plate Clara put in front of him had been hers. Jonathan had spent years surrounded by people who knew exactly how wealthy he was. People behaved differently around him. They laughed harder at his jokes, agreed more quickly,
became generous when generosity might be remembered. Clara Bennett didn't know his last name. She thought he was a wet, injured cowboy with a tired horse. She had no idea his cattle covered the valley. No idea he owned part of the bank threatening to take her home. No idea that 3 days later he would walk into her auction and make Silas Rourke wish he had chosen a completely different profession. She just saw a hungry stranger and gave him the last proper meal in her house. I think we like to imagine character revealing itself in enormous dramatic moments. A battlefield, a disaster, a gunfight. Most of us will never experience those moments. Usually it is something smaller. Who gets the last plate of food? What do you do when nobody important is watching? How do you treat someone who cannot do anything for you? Clara thought she was feeding a stranger. Jonathan thought he was accepting a meal. Neither understood that the decision made in that small kitchen during a storm would eventually expose a land fraud, save several families from losing their homes, and completely change both of their lives. Silas Rourke thought the Bennett Ranch was valuable because of the creek. Jonathan Hale originally saw it as another parcel on a map. Clara knew what neither of them understood. It was where Thomas had built the kitchen table, where Emily had learned to walk, where the unfinished fence still leaned near the barn, where a stranger once appeared during a storm, and where a woman with almost nothing put her own dinner in front of him and told him to eat. Out of all the land Jonathan Hale owned, that little ranch eventually became the place he called home.